There are families that keep the real record and families that keep the official one. The official record is the story told at dinner tables and holiday gatherings and funerals, the version where everyone's contributions are distributed evenly and no one is written out. The real record is kept somewhere else. Sometimes in a ledger. Sometimes in a letter. Sometimes, as it turned out in my family, in a small digital voice recorder that my mother kept in the second drawer of her nightstand for 11 years and 4 months. I did not know about the recorder until the morning of the estate meeting. My name is Rosalind Okafor, and I am 44 years old. I am a high school English teacher in the same small town where I grew up, which means I have spent my entire adult life within 20 minutes of the house where my parents lived, which means I was the one who showed up. I showed up for 11 years. And on the morning my father pointed across the mahogany table in Gerald Thackeray's law office and told the room that I had never been there, that my sister had carried everything alone, I sat very still, and I did not say one word. Because the lawyer had a recorder on the desk. And my mother had already said it for me. My mother, Claudette Okafor, died in September, on a Wednesday morning, at home, in the bedroom where she had slept for 38 years. She was 72. She had been living with a progressive neurological condition for the last 4 years of her life, the kind that moves slowly at first, then less slowly, and then all at once. She did not go dramatically. She went the way she had done most things in her life. Quietly, with dignity, and without making a fuss that would inconvenience anyone. She was the most considerate person I have ever known. That consideration, I came to understand only in the last years of her life, was something she had learned early, and at some cost. My father, Winston Okafor, is 76 years old. He is a retired civil engineer, a man of firm opinions and very little revision, the kind of man who decides what is true about a situation early and then organizes all subsequent evidence around that decision rather than the other way around. He decided something about me a long time ago. I am still not entirely sure when. But by the time I was old enough to notice, the decision had already been made and calcified and was being presented as simple observable fact. The decision was this. My younger sister, Paulette, was the devoted one. She was the one who called. The one who remembered birthdays without prompting. The one who drove down from the city for holidays with her husband and their 2 children and filled the house with the kind of warm noise that my father associated with family, doing what family was supposed to do. I was the one who stayed nearby. I was the one in the same town, 10 minutes away, who came on Tuesdays and sometimes Thursdays and managed the prescriptions and sat in the waiting rooms and made the insurance calls and learned, at a certain point, not to mention any of it at the dinner table because it made my father uncomfortable in a way he expressed by changing the subject. Paulette lives in the city. She visits 4 times a year. She sends flowers on my mother's birthday and calls every Sunday between 2 and 2:15, reliably, cheerfully, for as long as I can remember. She is warm and she is present in the ways that are visible, and she loves our mother genuinely. I want to be clear about that because what happened in that lawyer's office was not Paulette's fault, and I have never believed it was. What it was my father's story. And my father told his story the way he told all his stories, with the confidence of a man who has never once considered that he might be missing information. He told people Paulette was the devoted daughter. At church, at the barbershop, at the neighborhood association meetings where he had been a fixture for 30 years. He said it with a particular warmth of a father proud of his child, and Paulette, who did not know the full shape of what I had been doing because I had never made a point of cataloging it in front of anyone, accepted the description without correcting it, not because she was dishonest, but because she was not aware there was anything to correct. I want to tell you about my father's motivation because I think it matters. Winston Okafor was the oldest son in a family where the oldest son's role was clearly defined. He provided. He made decisions. He was the one others organized around. My mother's illness challenged that structure in ways he was not equipped to manage. It required asking for help, acknowledging limitation, accepting the presence of a daughter in his home on a regular basis, doing things he felt, on some level, should not need to be done by anyone outside the marriage. His pride organized itself around the story that everything was managed, that the family was strong, that Paulette's visible affection was the thing that mattered most. The quiet, instrumental work I did was absorbed into the background because acknowledging it would have meant acknowledging the need it was meeting. And my father did not acknowledge need. He never had. I understood this. Understanding it did not make it smaller. I had started going to my parents' house every Tuesday in January of 2013, the winter my mother first began having symptoms that no one had named yet. She was dizzy sometimes. Her handwriting changed. She dropped things. My father said she was tired, that she had always been clumsy, that she just needed more rest. I drove over on a Tuesday because I had a free period in the afternoon, and I wanted to see for myself. I sat with her for 2 hours, and when I left I called her primary care doctor from the parking lot of the school where I taught and made an appointment for the following week. That was the first Tuesday. There were 563 more. Love that demands you shrink is not love. It is management. I had been managed by my father's version of our family for a very long time, and I had stayed small inside it not because I was weak, but because I had decided, somewhere along the way, that the work itself was enough, that it did not need to be witnessed to be real.
I was wrong about that.
I understand now that witness matters, that the record matters, that someone has to keep it. My mother understood that too. The estate meeting was scheduled for the 14th of October, 6 weeks after my mother's death. Gerald Thackeray's office is on the main street of our town, above the hardware store, in a building that has been there since 1962. The waiting room has wood-paneled walls and a photograph of the county courthouse and chairs with cushions that were last reupholstered sometime in the late 90s. I arrived at 9:15. Paulette and her husband, James, arrived at 9:22. My father arrived at 9:30, which was the meeting's scheduled start time, and which was how he had always operated, never early, never late, always exactly on time in the manner of a man who considered punctuality a form of authority. Gerald Thackeray is a compact, careful man in his early 60s with reading glasses he keeps on a chain around his neck. He had been my parents' attorney for 22 years. He handled the estate, which was straightforward, the house to my father, the contents to be divided between Paulette and me, a small account to each of us, the details already settled. We were almost done when my father said it. Gerald had just finished walking through the summary of the account distributions. Paulette was asking a clarifying question about the timeline for the house. My father was looking at his watch. And then he said, not to anyone in particular, but loudly enough for the whole room, Paulette has been the one holding this family together.
I want that said.
Especially now. She was there for your mother in ways that made a real difference. She carried most of it. He gestured toward me without looking at me. Rosalind is nearby. That's something. But nearby and present aren't the same thing. Your mother knew that. The room was quiet. Paulette looked at the table. James looked at the window. I looked at my father.
He was still looking at his watch.
I had known, at some level, that this might come. That in some version of this gathering, in some configuration of chairs and documents and family members, my father would find a moment to say the thing he had been saying in smaller ways for 11 years. I had imagined, in various idle moments over the past few years, what I might say back. I had prepared a sentence or two, mentally, for different versions of the conversation. I did not use any of them. I sat with both hands flat on my knees under the table, and I looked at my father, and I did not speak. I did not cry. I did not correct him. I did not give the room the version of this where I become the daughter who cannot get through a legal meeting without making it about herself. Because Gerald Thackeray had set something on the desk before the meeting began. A small gray digital recorder, no larger than a deck of cards, placed to the left of the document folder. He had not explained it yet, but I had noticed it when I walked in, and I had thought about it during the entire meeting, and I thought about it now, as my father folded his hands and waited for someone to agree with him. Gerald cleared his throat. Gerald Thackeray was not a dramatic man. He did not announce things. He did not build to moments. He simply managed situations with the competent, unhurried manner of someone who had sat in small rooms with grieving families for 2 decades and understood that most situations, handled correctly, resolve themselves. He picked up the recorder. He set it in the center of the table. He said, "Before we close, I need to address one additional item. Claudette came to see me 14 months ago. She brought this and she left instructions. She asked that it be played at this meeting, for the family, after the estate business was concluded. He looked at my father. Winston, she was specific that it be played in your presence. She was specific that it be played today. My father looked at the recorder. He said, "What is it?" Gerald said, "She called it her diary. She said she had been making entries for about 11 years. She marked one entry specifically and asked that one be played. I haven't listened to it. She asked me not to." The room was very still. I want to tell you what I felt sitting in that chair in Gerald Thackeray's office on the 14th of October, 6 weeks after my mother died. I want to be honest about it because I think honesty about this particular thing matters more than a clean account of events. I did not feel triumphant. I did not feel the particular satisfaction I might have imagined feeling in some hypothetical version of this scene. What I felt was closer to a very old and quiet grief, the grief of someone who has spent 11 years not needing to be seen and who is now, in the space of 60 seconds, about to be seen entirely. It is a particular sensation. It is not comfortable. It is something more complicated than comfort. I thought about the Tuesday mornings. The ones in winter when I drove over before school and made sure the heat was working and that my mother had taken her first round of medications with something in her stomach. The ones in spring when she was having a good stretch and we would sit at the kitchen table and she would ask about my students and I would tell her about them and she would listen with the specific engaged attention she had always given to stories about young people. The ones in the last year when the good stretches were shorter and I would sit beside her bed and hold her hand while she slept because she had told me, in one of her clearer moments, that she did not like waking up alone. 563 Tuesdays. I had never counted them until I was sitting in that chair. Gerald set the recorder down and looked at the room. "Would anyone like a moment before I play it?" My father said, "Just play it."
Paulette looked at me.
I looked at the recorder. Gerald pressed play. I need to stop here and tell you about the 3 weeks before that meeting because they belong to this story, even though they happened before the room and the recorder and my mother's voice. My mother died on a Wednesday in September. I was the one who found her. I had come at 7 in the morning because she had been having a difficult night and I had stayed late the evening before and told her I would be back early. She was gone before I got there. Peacefully, the hospice nurse said when she arrived. She had been comfortable. She had not been in distress. I sat with her for 20 minutes before I called anyone. I sat in the chair beside her bed, the wooden one with the blue cushion that had been there for as long as I could remember, and I held her hand and I talked to her, which I know sounds strange, but which felt like the right thing to do. I told her I was glad I had been there. I told her the garden was looking good still, and the zinnias she had planted in May had come back strong even after the heat in August. I told her I would make sure the house was taken care of. Then I called Paulette. Then I called my father, who was in the kitchen downstairs and who came upstairs and stood in the doorway and said nothing for a long time. In the 3 weeks between her death and the estate meeting, I functioned. I went to school. I taught my classes. I managed the paperwork and the calls and the thank you notes for the flowers. I moved through it all with the particular efficiency of someone who has been managing hard things for a long time and knows how to keep moving. But there was one evening, a Thursday, 9 days after she died, at 8:47 at night, when I sat down on the kitchen floor of my own house, my back against the cabinets, and I did not move for a very long time. I had been grading papers at the counter. The red pen was still in my hand. I had put the kettle on for tea, and then sat down while I waited for it to boil, and simply did not get back up. The kettle clicked off. The kitchen was quiet. Through the window above the sink, I could see the light was still on in the house across the street, and I watched it for a while without seeing it. I was not thinking about the recorder. I did not know about the recorder yet. I was thinking about something smaller and more specific, that my mother had known the shape of every Tuesday for 11 years, had known what I brought, and what I did and what it cost, and had never once said, directly, plainly, with my father in the room, that she saw it. And I understood her reasons. I had always understood her reasons. But sitting on that kitchen floor at 8:47 on a Thursday night, 9 days after she died, I allowed myself to feel the weight of what those 11 years of silence had cost. I sat there for 41 minutes. The red pen made a small mark on the knee of my trousers when I finally stood up. I looked at it for a moment. Then I finished making the tea, and I went back to the papers, and I kept going. That is what it looked like from the outside. That is what it usually looked like. 563 Tuesdays are not nothing. Some kindnesses are loans the lender forgets they're keeping. I had made 563 deposits into a ledger I never expected to be opened. My mother's voice came into the room the way her voice had always come into rooms, measured, clear, with the slight formality of a woman who had been a librarian for 31 years and who believed that words, spoken or written, deserved to be handled precisely. She said, "This is Claudette Okafor. Today is the 18th of March, 2014. The recorder had a small speaker. It was sufficient for that room. Gerald Thackeray had his hands folded on the desk. Paulette had both her arms wrapped around herself. My father had gone very still in the way. He went still when he was processing something he had not expected. She said, "Rosalind came this morning at 7:45. She brought the prescription from the pharmacy because I had mentioned last week that Winston doesn't like making that particular drive. She sat with me for 2 hours. She asked about the Hendersons across the street, and I told her about the new dog, and she laughed. Before she left, she called the insurance line about the authorization for the physical therapy referral and was on hold for 22 minutes. She did not complain about the 22 minutes. She brought Earl Grey tea in the tin with the blue lid. I have noted this because I want there to be a record." The recorder played. My mother's voice moved through time in the way that recorded voices do, present and past at once, the person both gone and completely there. She said, in another entry, dated 11 months later, "Rosalind came Tuesday. It was a difficult week. I had a bad day on Saturday and Winston handled it poorly. He does not know how to be with illness and I have made my peace with that, and by Tuesday, I was still low. She did not try to fix it. She sat with me, and we watched the birds from the kitchen window, and she did not say anything cheerful or unhelpful. I want to note that the not saying is sometimes the harder thing." Another entry. 2 years after that. "Rosalind drove me to the neurologist today. It was the appointment with the results I had been dreading. She sat in a room with me, and she asked the questions I had forgotten to write down. Afterward, we went to the diner on Clement Street and had soup, and she did not cry in front of me, which I knew was a choice she was making on my behalf. She cried in the car afterward. I heard her from the waiting area outside. I want this noted. She gave me a whole Tuesday, every week for 4 years by this point. I want it in the record." The entry Gerald had marked was the last one. Dated 6 weeks before my mother died. She said, "I am making this final entry because I am tired and I want to say this clearly while I still can. Rosalind has come every Tuesday for 11 years and 4 months. She has managed my medications, my appointments, my insurance, my bad days, and my good ones. She has done this without asking for acknowledgement and without receiving it, and I know this because I know my husband and I know my family and I know what gets seen and what is not. I am leaving this recording with Gerald because I want it said in a room where it cannot be managed or minimized or revised. I want Winston to hear it. I want Paulette to hear it. I want Rosalind to hear it from me, in my own voice, with everyone present. She was there. She was there every week. She carried it. That is the truth, and I want it in the record, permanent and clear, so that it cannot be taken from her after I am gone." The recorder clicked to silence. My mother had been speaking for 4 minutes and 37 seconds. The room stayed quiet for a long time after. Gerald Thackeray did not say anything immediately. He sat with his hands folded and let the room be quiet for what felt like 2 full minutes, which in a small office above a hardware store with 4 people in it is a very long time. My father was looking at the recorder. Not at me, not at Paulette. At the small gray device in the center of the table, as if it were still speaking. Paulette said, very quietly, "Rosalind. I didn't know." I looked at her. Her eyes were wet, and her voice was steady, and she meant it completely. I knew she meant it. I said, "I know you didn't." My father said nothing for a long time. When he finally spoke, he said, "She recorded all of that." It was not a question. It was the sound of a man rearranging something fundamental, not quickly, not gracefully, but genuinely, in real time, in a small room where there was nowhere else to look. I did not respond to that either. There was nothing to say to it that my mother had not already said with more precision and more permanence than I could manage. Gerald said he would give us a few minutes and stepped out. The door made a small sound closing behind him. The three of us sat in that room for about 8 minutes. I know because I looked at the clock on the wall, a plain round clock with a white face, the kind that has been in law offices since before any of us were born, and noted the time when Gerald left and the time when he came back. 8 minutes and 14 seconds, just the three of us, in a room with a recorder that had just replayed 11 years. Paulette talked first. She said she had not understood the scope of it. She said she had known I visited, had known I was nearby, but had not known the Tuesdays were every week without exception, had not known about the insurance calls and the pharmacy runs and the appointments. She said she felt, and this is the exact word she used, ashamed, not of me. She was clear about that, but of the story she had let stand without examining it. She said she wanted to understand better what those years had looked like. We talked for a long time that evening. Not in Gerald's office. He concluded the meeting shortly after he returned, with the quiet efficiency of a man who understood that the legal business was finished and the rest of it was not his, but at my kitchen table, with tea, the navy wool coat I had been wearing still on the back of my chair because I had forgotten to hang it up. Paulette and I sat together until nearly 11 at night. James had gone back to the hotel after an hour, understanding it was not his conversation to be in, which I appreciated about him. My father did not come to my kitchen that evening. He went home. That was what he did. He called me 4 days later. It was a Sunday morning, 7:23, earlier than he usually called anyone. I was at my kitchen table with my coffee and the lesson plans I had been trying to finish since Friday. He said, "I've been thinking about what your mother recorded." I said I had been thinking about it too. He said, "I didn't see it clearly. The work you were doing. I built a story about your sister that didn't have room in it for what you were doing, and I told that story a lot of times." He paused. He was not a man who paused often, and the pause was uncomfortable in the way that real things are uncomfortable. "I'm not sure I knew I was doing it. That might be worse." I said, "I think it might be." Another pause. He said, "I'd like to do better. I want to be honest with you about what I felt on that Sunday morning at 7:23, because I think the honest version is the only version worth telling. I did not feel the particular relief I had imagined feeling if this conversation ever happened. I felt something steadier and less resolved than relief. I felt the beginning of something that I understood might take years and might never be fully finished and might require a great deal of patience on my part for which I would not always be adequately thanked. I said, "I'd like that too." We talked for 11 more minutes. Practical things, the house, a question he had about one of the estate documents, a neighbor who had called about the garden. When I hung up, I sat at the table for a while with my coffee going cold. My friend Adiz, who teaches mathematics 2 classrooms down from mine, and who has been my closest colleague for 14 years, asked me the following week how I was doing with all of it. We were in the break room, both of us between classes, and she asked in the direct and unadorned way that Adiz asks things. She is not interested in fine as an answer. I told her about the recorder. I told her about my father's call. I told her the whole of it in about 12 minutes, while we both stood at the counter with our coffees. She listened without interrupting. Then she said, "Your mother knew exactly what she was doing." I said, "Yes, she did." Adiz said, "She built you a record. For after." I thought about that for a long time. I am still thinking about it. My father is 76 years old, and he is who he is, and the years ahead will be what they are. I have thought carefully about what I owe him and what I am willing to give and where the lines are. What I have settled on is this: I will continue to be present in the practical ways that need to be covered. I will not pretend the 11 years did not happen or that the official version of our family was ever accurate. I will not require him to be different than he is capable of being, but I will not organize myself around his comfort at the expense of my own clarity. That is a different set of terms than the ones I lived by for 11 years. It feels different. It is harder in some ways and easier in others and more honest than anything I managed before. I want to be precise about my father because being precise about him is the only way I can live with any of it. He is not a cruel man. He is a man who grew up understanding his value in terms of what he could build and provide and decide, and my mother's illness asked him to be a different kind of person in a different kind of story, and he was not capable of it. His insistence on the version of the family that had Paulette at the center of it was not malice. It was the defensive architecture of a man who needed everything to be manageable and under control, and the truth of what I was doing every Tuesday exposed the fact that things had not been manageable and under control at all. Acknowledging my contribution meant acknowledging the need it was meeting. And the need was something he had never allowed himself to fully see. That is not an excuse. That is an explanation. And the difference between those two things is the only solid ground I have found to stand on. I keep the recorder now. Gerald Thackeray returned it to me after the meeting, per my mother's written instructions, in a sealed envelope she had left with him alongside the recorder. The envelope contained a note in her handwriting, small, precise, the librarian's hand, that said, "For Rosalind. All of it is for you.
Keep it, M."
The recorder sits in the cedar box on my bedroom shelf, beside the Earl Grey tin with the blue lid that I've been refilling for 3 years and the small framed certificate from my teaching credential program that I never got around to hanging properly.
I take it out sometimes.
I do not always play it. Sometimes I just hold it. Forgiveness is not access. I am still working out what that means specifically for my father, and I have given myself permission to take the time that it takes. Some reconciliations are not clean.
Some of them are a Tuesday at a time.
Some people only know how to love what they can see and name and announce. My father loved Paulette loudly and me quietly, not because the love was different in kind, but because the visibility was. My mother knew that quiet love needed its own record, its own proof, its own voice in a room full of people who had been hearing the official story for too long. The cost of carrying a family's hardest work without acknowledgement is not just the labor. It is the slow erosion of believing that the labor was real, that you were real, that the invisible things you did added up to something that mattered. My mother understood that cost. She spent 11 years making sure it would not be the permanent price. Family is whoever keeps the honest record. My mother kept it entry by entry, date by date, in a small gray recorder in the second drawer of her nightstand. She kept it for 11 years because she understood that the record would matter, that there would come a morning when the official story was being told in a room with everyone present, and the truth would need its own voice. Losing an illusion is still better than living inside one. I lost the illusion that invisibility was a reasonable price for keeping the peace. It was not. It never was. If someone in your life has been carrying the hardest work for years while the credit was handed to someone else, if you have been the one who showed up when no one was keeping count, I want to ask you this. What would you do if you found out someone had been keeping count all along? And if no one was, who should be keeping it now?